So let's start with our ascendancy and look at Exsanguinate and Reap and see why we would pick Golemancer for this build. Exsanguinate scales off of spell damage and generic damage and physical damage. It's a physical spell, but unlike Blade Vortex, for example, it's not a spell that we want to convert into a different element. And so the Golemancer is an excellent choice, maybe the only choice, maybe the best choice that I can see right now anyways, because of these two nodes right here. Every time we summon an additional golem, we get 25% increased damage. Now this is just straight damage that affects both the front end hit of Exsanguinate as well as the damage per second or damage over time component. So clearly with this build, we're going to want to summon a bunch of golems if we can and pump up that generic damage increase as much as possible. For our third ascendancy set of points, we are definitely going to go with Shaper of Storms because it gives us a straight 15% damage multiplier with the base chance of our shock increased damage taken being 15%. And then the final question for our Uber ascendancy is going to be either Bastion of Elements or Shaper of Winter. Shaper of Winter is nice because we chill things, we slow their action speed by 15% at a minimum. However, I'm not so sure that it's going to be worth it over a elemental damage shield because a lot of the hits that we're going to be taking are going to be high elemental damage. We're certainly going to be taking our fair share of physical damage, but because of the increased buff effect on our Chaos Golem, we are getting actually a decent amount of physical reduction considering we have zero investment into armor. So to me, Bastion of Elements is probably, in most cases, maybe all cases, the stronger pick. Now this is a good time to talk about the tree because, like I said earlier, the spell is going to scale off of generic spell damage, generic increased damage, and increased physical damage and physical damage over time. If you're familiar with this section of the tree or the tree in general, generic increase to spell damage is relatively rare. A lot of this stuff is tied to an element. So the problem with this is that we really want to get up to Golem Commander, and the easiest way to get there that actually benefits us is going to be go through these minion nodes here and then up through and get a jewel slot. We don't crit, we don't care about critting, so instability is a bad choice. And we want to get up here so we can have Golem Commander, an extra golem, and all the other increases that come with it. So the problem this presents to us is that Lord of the Dead and minion damage don't help us unless we go over here and get Spiritual Aid, a relatively niche notable that not a ton of builds use because this is kind of, in my experience anyway, a fairly unique layout for a passive tree that wants to take. So this means we're going to get over into this section as well, which works out pretty well because this is where most of the physical damage nodes are, down here, as well as the skill effect duration, which we'll get into in a second. So when you're leveling up this build, what I would do is I would start here, I would hit Arcanist Dominion, and I would travel down here into the Templar section, and then you can split off and go over here, get these physical damage related nodes, and get over here into Vanquisher. And if you want to, while you're leveling up, you won't have access to Cluster Jewels, so you might travel down here into Vitality Extraction. This is pretty nice sustain, especially in the ultimatums where you're killing lots of little mobs. It will heal you a lot during these fights because you get the 2% of life on kill. You're actually killing a ton of monsters a lot of the time, so you're going to see your health bar just spike right back up, which is really cool. And if you want to, I originally went down here into Exceptional Performance for a little while here to get the extra increased skill effect duration. That's not a bad selection while you're leveling up as well. And the reason we get the skill effect duration is so that we can increase the, see how it says base duration 1.0 seconds. Down here, this debuff, the damage over time aspect of the skill, lasts 2 seconds as it stands right now. So that means that 88,000 or so physical damage per second is going to last for 2 seconds. So that number is actually doubled. Now, when it comes to the cluster jewels, you have a large cluster that you absolutely need to have Primordial Bond. If we take a look at this notable, you are getting extra damage per summon golem, an extra buff effect, and all that good stuff. Increased life on the golems, that's great too. In terms of our medium clusters, we want the physical damage over time small nodes. I picked up Rend here, which is going to be a 12% physical damage over time multiplier, which is the thing that we want to scale. We want to scale that damage over time effect on our skill because that's going to be the heaviest hitting thing since we can stack it 3 times. That's pretty great, and increase its duration, so we get to, it'll last 2 seconds and stacks, so that's pretty good. And as for our second cluster, we have Blood Artist. There are some really good second mods that you can get, second notables, on these medium cluster jewels. The one that gives you recover percent of life after every kill, so that you get the same effect as Vitality Extraction without having to travel all the way down here, because that's a lot of points. For now, this will do fine, and these jewels are pretty cheap. As for our small clusters, we really want to just get life because we don't have a lot of defensive layers on this build. There's not really much we can do on that front except stack more life. So the obvious choice is to get small clusters with either Surging Vitality or Natural Vigor. I think there might be a third one, but I forget. And just stack some life as much as you can. And you'll notice that outside of the obvious damage choices of skill effect duration and the limited number of physical damage related nodes, as well as a couple of the minion nodes that we can use because of spiritual aid, there's really not a lot for us to get on the tree except life. So it kind of synergizes pretty well on that respect because we don't have many defensive layers, so the best thing we can do is get more life, and that's really what the tree wants to do. It doesn't really have the problem of like sword related builds because there's a lot of sword nodes that are good. So you run out of, places that you can go because you run out of points. In this build, there really isn't a whole lot of other places I'd want to go on the tree. So that feels good. All right, let's talk about the gear that we use. Cold Iron Point is going to be incredible because spells scale really well with gem levels across the board, and because there is a damage over time component on this, and we can only scale it really through increased spell damage on one-hand weapons or two-hand weapons, it makes a lot more sense to get plus gem levels, and fortunately we have Cold Iron Point, which fits this need exactly. So 2 of these is the only thing that really makes sense for this build. It's possible that a rare weapon might be better in theory, but it's the beginning of the league, and if there is one that exists, it's certainly not going to be in existence for a long time, and no one's going to be able to afford it if it does get created. So, Cold Iron Point, they're like 30 to 40 chaos. They're achievable, you can farm for them, that's not too bad. Our helm is going to be a minion damage helm because we get increased damage from minions, so Bone Helmet helps, and we can get +1 to level of socketed gems or +2, and throw most of our golems in here. Not all of them, because in the tier 14 to 16 areas, they can start dying a little bit more consistently, so it helps a lot to have minion life, but we'll talk about gems in a second. As for our amulet, ideally, in my opinion, you want to get the Primordial Chain. I got super lucky and happened to get one out of an ultimatum, which is very fortunate. Another way you could go is getting a plus physical spell gems amulet, and one that has +2 strength gems, because Exsanguinate and Reap are both strength and int gems, so that works for that. For our armor, we're basically just going for as much life as possible, and maybe dexterity if you need some stats on it. That's what I've gone for here. I'm pretty sure, almost certain, that an Inpulsa is going to be the next step to upgrade. They're currently like 7 exalts for a 6-link, so I've decided to not try to farm for that right now, because this works pretty well. The shock explosions and increased damage, but mostly the explosions, are going to be a big help in our ultimatums because of all of the humongous monster density. We can kill one thing, it starts a chain reaction of killing everything else. That's going to be really good. Impulsa is the obvious choice here. We definitely want to go with that. I don't think there's a better item, at least not for the next week or two, that is even going to be even remotely affordable. I've heard that the numbers on the Explode Chest mods are not so bad that they're unusable, and I'm willing to bet that there will be a chest that has like +1 to socketed gem levels for another level on our Exsanguinate, as well as the Explode mod and tons of life and all this stuff, but that stuff's not going to exist for a little while, and when it does get made, at least in the short term, again, it's not going to be affordable, so I would just go with a 6-link corrupted armor because it's going to be cheaper with the colors that you want and tons of life on it until we can eventually get an Inpulsa. Our rings are kind of what you would expect. I have stat fixing here for dexterity, resistances, and life. We also want a curse on hit with vulnerability, of course, because we run out of gem sockets because of our golems primarily. And our belt is, again, just going to be life, resist, same with our boots. Our gauntlets are going to be Essence of Hysteria, I'm pretty sure, for the more damage over time modifier. As you can see, these are just a pair of gloves that really are not very good. They just have the more damage, and we're going to throw in our Corrupting Fever into here, of course, so that we can get the most out of that as possible. All right, let's take a look at the gems that are in this gear. I'm just going to pick at random here. So in one of our Cold Iron points, we have Stormbrand, Flame Dash, and Arcane Surge. Arcane Surge gives us a more spell damage multiplier and increased cast speed, which is actually really useful. The mana regeneration we don't really care about as much, but this allows us to guarantee that we have Arcane Surge up all the time because we do use Stormbrand. Stormbrand is really useful for this build because if you look at Corrupting Fever, it says inflicts the Corrupting Blood debuff on enemies you hit. So Stormbrand hits, and it hits pretty fast, and you can have 3 of them in a little ring of a ton of mobs, and it can hit them. It's an obvious synergy. We want to pick that up. It helps us keep the Corrupted Blood stacks. In our helmet, we want to have 3 of our golems. I've chosen the ones that I think are the most important, which are Chaos, Lightning, and Stone. Those are by far the best ones to have up if any are going to die. I'd rather be the Flame Golem and deal a little bit less damage. The Lightning Golem makes sure that we are casting our Exsanguinate really fast with our Unleash stacks, and it helps us too a little bit with our Flame Dash if we find ourselves in a situation where we make a mistake and we hit it too fast and we don't get the instant cast. So we're going to socket that with minion life because as we push into tier 14 to 16s, things start to hit pretty hard. So we want to make sure that our golems live as much as we can. Over in our other Cold Iron point, we're going to have Malevolence socketed by itself so it doesn't get modified with the mana multiplier. And other than that, we're going to have Flesh and Stone and Maim. This is a really nice synergy because Flesh and Stone is going to guarantee that we're maiming things, and things that get maimed with Maim support are going to take increased physical damage. And when things take increased types of damage, that is actually a more multiplier, so that's really good for us. And onto our boots, we have Whirling Blades, Fortify, faster attacks, and I threw in our Flame Golem here. I like to be able to have 2 movement skills, and I really wanted to have Fortify for something to help us because we don't have dodge, we don't have block, not really, and we needed something to help mitigate some of that incoming damage. So that made sense to me. And we saw over here already we have Corrupting Fever with Swift Affliction and Efficacy for damage over time and skill effect duration. That's really important. And Brutality is, of course, the best choice because it now works with everything and it's a humongous more physical damage multiplier. Now, for our main spell, this one is, right now for me, it's Exsanguinate with Cruelty. I think is probably the best. It's hard to tell. Efficacy, Unleash is really great, and we'll get to that in a second. Brutality and Chain. Chain really helps us with our clear. We can hot swap that out. If we swap, you'll see I have Swift Affliction, Leveling, and once this hits level 20, it's going to live right here. And for bosses, I'm just going to swap in like that and get a pretty big damage over time buff. But while we're clearing and while we're killing most bosses, the Chain support is just fine. We deal 11% less damage. That's okay. The follow-up unleashes deal a little bit less damage. It's not too bad, and considering the clear potential that it has, since we don't have an explode chest of any kind, it's pretty good. Once I get an Inpulsa, I would say that you probably don't need Chain anymore, and you can just run Swift Affliction all the time. That's a bit of speculation on my part, but I'm pretty sure that's accurate. So why Unleash? Unleash synergizes really well. It's almost like it was made with Unleash in mind because the damage over time stacks 3 times and Unleash has a base stack essentially of 3 casts. And so we can click once, cast really fast all 3 of our Exsanguinates if we have them built up, and then move while that damage over time is taking place on the enemy. And passively we have Stormbrand hitting as well, building up those Corrupted Fever stacks. And so it kind of looks like this. You are waiting for your Unleash stacks to build up, maybe to 2 or 3 while you're running around in an ultimatum ring or running around the map. When you have a single target boss that you're fighting and maybe you don't have to move for a second, you can absolutely just sit there and just cast it over and over, and that's not a problem, but it really shines in ultimatums where you have to cast and move, cast and move. So you can get most of your damage output, if not all of it, while you are also evading attacks. So that playstyle, it's pretty active, but it works out pretty well with Unleash. Let's look for a second at the tree and where it is now and the items that I have and kind of where we can go to get some more damage, get some more survivability out of the build, at least what I'm thinking about right now. The first one that comes to mind is our cluster jewels. Blood Artist is good, but to also have Brush with Death on there, which gives us recover percent life on kill and 10% damage over time multiplier, would be really good. These jewels like that with Blood Artist as well as Brush with Death are pretty expensive right now. Last I checked, there was only one up there for about 8 exalts, so I wasn't quite ready to drop that kind of cash on it. If we had 2 of those though, that would be really good for the build. Another question I had is the proper anointment for the build. We can either go to Exceptional Performance, might be good. I currently have Growth and Decay, which I thought was pretty powerful. And the third one could be Vitality Extraction, but if we have Brush with Death Cluster Jewels, then we're already recovering. The passive Life Flask gaining charges is pretty good, and maybe that's worthwhile on boss fights, I'm not sure. But on boss fights, we have massive amounts of regeneration, so maybe that's not so great, especially coupled with 2 Surging Vitalities, which will recover our life, 10% of it, every 4 seconds over 1 second. And you put these into your tree so that they occur at different times, so that's pretty powerful. Last thing I'm looking at on the tree is going to be our jewel sockets. We really want to get an Anima Stone. That's going to be about 6% increased damage here. 5.8, total DPS 8.7%. So that's pretty powerful. And for our third Primordial, we're probably going to go with Primordial Eminence for increased buff effect. That will help us out a little bit too with cast speed, some regeneration, some physical damage reduction, and that'll get us our third primordial item, which will give us 2 extra golems, which is pretty great. And then we can probably get to another jewel socket pretty easily. We have a couple in place here. We have one close by here. We have one right next to our tree here. We're already pathing through one right here. So we can throw in another jewel for maximum life, some global physical damage, or physical damage over time, whichever one gives us more damage. And finally, if we do end up getting that rare chest that has explosion and +1 to socketed gems and all that good stuff, and we threw in a level 4 empower, making it effectively level 5, then we're looking at a 56% damage increase from this one gem, so I'm sure we can figure out which one of these others don't do as well. And I picked up a Witchfire Brew just because it has increased damage over time damage. It conflicts a little bit with the level 21 Despair Curse aura. I don't actually know which one is doing more damage between Vulnerability and Despair, but either way, everything around me and anything that gets hit is going to have one of these curses, and they both deal extra damage for us, so either one's fine. And as it stands, the build overall is pretty cheap. Right now, the Primordial Chain is probably the most expensive single piece in here by a large margin, and it by itself really isn't all that much to farm through. If we get into an Anima Stone and Inpulsa, of course, that's going to drive the price up. But this build, as it stands right now, I'm having no issues running through tier 16s and getting through Sirus fights and the Conqueror fights and Maven fights. So I'm not really concerned about it at this point in time. It's a relatively cheap starter. It's got good damage output. It's got good survivability with the amount of hit points that we can get. And if I min-max that a little bit more, I'm sure we could get up to like 6,500 fairly easily. And so my verdict on the build so far is it's a pretty good starter. I would go with Exsanguinate next time. It's a fun build. The playstyle is pretty cool with automatically shooting out 9 tendrils that hit things, so it's easy to clear stuff without putting on like lesser multiple projectiles or something else that lowers our damage by a lot. The Unleash playstyle feels really good. So yeah, if you're looking for a build with Exsanguinate, this is a pretty good way to go. That's it for this video. Hope you found it enjoyable and interesting. In the video description below, you'll find a few Path of Building links for this build. As it was leveling up, it started at level 86 is my earliest Path of Building, and all the way up to what it currently is. And you just got my thoughts on where I think it will go for increasing its damage, so that's where we can move. I'll put out an update video when I finalize this build and feel like it's gotten to its maximum potential, or at least as far as I want to go with it. And if you're still watching this far into the video, thank you very much. I appreciate that. We're closing in on 1,000 subs. If you aren't subbed already, I would like it if you would. That helps me get there to our community features so I can build and grow a little bit more easily. Until next time, this is Eli signing off.